This episode of The Foretop is coming to you courtesy of Live. That's Live, an insider tip that stands for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. Live is the leading third-party certifier of sustainable wine growing in the U.S. Pacific Northwest. You can see Live certification on wines from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. I have personally worked with Live and its members for years, and I just have to say I'm so proud to have them as a supporter. So stay tuned, folks, for our sponsor break later in the show. You can hear more about Live and its members' commitment to climate action, worker rights, natural resource conservation, and so much more. Thank you so much, Live. And now it's time for the Foretop.
There's many things that people can argue about, but you know what's risky about arguing about climate change?
What?
It always turns into a heated debate.
Well, hello and welcome to the Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine world. I am your host, Catherine Cole.
And I'm your host, Martin Reyes, Master of Wine, and we're drawing to the close of our sustainability season here at the Foretop, which means it's time to discuss the sixth pillar, Catherine, and that is climate action and regenerative agriculture.
Yes, this is it. We're rounding up the season with this sixth pillar, and I'm really curious to get into this conversation. And I think some of our listeners may have heard this buzz phrase, regenerative agriculture, and wondered what it means exactly. So I'm interested to hear more about this and why it's part of the sixth pillar, why it's part of the huge overriding topic of climate action. There's a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, Catherine, as we've gone through the five previous pillars, water, energy, waste management, DEI, social justice. I think the key here is that we understand the systemic nature of sustainability, and they are deeply interrelated. The pillars are, and that's what really the message is about the sixth pillar.
Oh, I can't wait to get into that. Why don't we reintroduce our guest from the intro episode of the sustainability season? Anna Brittain, who's joining us to close out the season. She is a leader in environmental management and policy who has worked as a sustainability consultant for many organizations, including Ontario Craft Wineries, Sustainable Wine Growing, British Columbia, Crimson Wine Group, and the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance. She's currently the executive director of Napa Green and co-founder, along with this guy right here, Martin of Napa Rise. Anna, it's so lovely to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me back and for doing this sustainability series.
Welcome back, Anna. And we're also joined by the world famous Dr. Jamie Goode. Jamie is the author of 5 books on wine, including the most relevantly and most recently, the book on regenerative viticulture. He is a wine columnist for the Sunday Express in the UK and a contributor to a number of wine publications and a regular international wine judge and lecturer. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for joining us in the evening your time. We really appreciate it, Jamie. And we want to pose the first question of the day to you because we know you put years of research and writing into the book Regenerative Viticulture, which listeners, you should run out and buy immediately. So we are going to ask you to do the impossible and define what is regenerative viticulture, and can you do it really quickly? Ready, set, go.
The clue is in the name. Regenerative means that one of the goals of regenerative viticulture is restoring life to the soils, so regenerating the life of the soils. More specifically, it's the application of a branch of science called agroecology. So it's seeing the vineyard as an ecosystem, and you want to get this ecosystem working so that the ecosystem does the job that currently in more conventional viticulture, the inputs are doing. So you're reducing inputs, you're increasing resilience, you're increasing biodiversity, and you're creating an ecosystem that works not just above the ground, but also below the ground.
And I'd love to jump in as well with a little more on the definition, just because I feel like regenerative viticulture has become like the latest kind of a little bit of an eye roll, similar to how sustainability has been over the years of, it's the latest term, what's the real substance behind it? So I thought I would just share some of the kind of grounded examples of what we work with grower members on, which is these kind of win-win-win practices like compost and cover crops and reduced tractor passes and reduced use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, which we'll talk more about. and bringing animals into the vineyard that do all these great things, increase water and nutrient retention and increase the happy microbes in the soil and the soil organic matter. Importantly, as Jamie was just saying, make the vines more resilient to disease and drought and heat stress, but also store more carbon in the soil, which is both good for the soil, but is also a really proactive role that farmers can play in climate change mitigation. And that relates to our climate action and regenerative ag conversation. So I wanted to throw that in there.
So, Anna, what would you say to a vineyard owner who says, oh, I just got my Napa green certification. Do I have to go get a regenerative farming certification too? I just heard that a vineyard in Oregon, Troon Vineyard, is the second vineyard in the world, fourth farm overall to receive the Regenerative Organic Alliance's certified gold designation. And I'm just wondering, what do you say to folks who are asking about, is this another certification I have to get?
That's a timely question. So we actually have a number of members that are pursuing both. And I was actually just giving a presentation with the head of the Regenerative Organic certification. I was just talking about, some of the ways we're similar and differ. And in many ways, there's many synergies. We have a prohibited and restricted pesticide list, and we also have a gold level that acknowledges members who are herbicide and neonicotinoid free. Say that 10 times fast. But we don't require organic. So that's kind of one difference from regenerative organic. I think there's some ways we go a little bit deeper, like around the social justice, diversity, and inclusion. And I think there's some areas like animals in the vineyard that or in the farm that they go a little bit deeper. So in many ways, there's a lot of complements, and most of our members don't feel that they need both, but we do have a couple pursuing it, and I'm curious to hear their feedback on the comparison between the two.
Interesting. And Jamie, you kind of have the big picture. You've written this book. You're seeing vineyards all over the world. I'm wondering, how widely is regenerative viticulture practiced worldwide? Is this something people are talking about, in South Africa, in regions that are far flung from here in the United States?
Well, I've seen quite a lot of interest in various aspects of regenerative viticulture in France, for instance. It's been taken pretty seriously, even by big companies, which is really encouraging. I've also seen quite a lot of interest in it in South Africa. You see, some of these things that are part of the regenerative toolkit are being applied already in forward-thinking wine regions where viticulturists are doing good things. I mean, the scientific basis behind regenerative farming isn't anything particularly new. It's just what's new is that these have all been brought together under this banner of regenerative, which gives a sort of coherent thought process to thinking about how to farm. I would say that the thing I think that's most important about regenerative viticulture is that we don't end up with a recipe. I think some other farming systems, you've got a recipe which has been applied worldwide in very different situations. And I think this is the thing about viticulture is when you travel, you'll see that different regions have got very different challenges, very different opportunities. And to create a recipe or a checklist of things that should be done by anybody who wants to farm regeneratively, I think would be a mistake. I think instead it should be offering people a toolkit of sort of regenerative approaches like cover cropping, like composting, like agroforestry, like incorporating animals in the vineyard, all these sorts of things that are ways of producing a vineyard that's far more sustainable, truly sustainable in the long run. And then letting people use their intelligence and their local knowledge of the situation they're in to then apply elements of this toolkit. And so in some ways, if we're going to talk about certifying regenerative, rather than a checklist and the point scoring, for each thing you do, I think it would be much better to look at the performance. What improvement has there been? Where did it start and where is it now? And that would involve, I guess, having some reliable metrics that could assess, how regenerative a vineyard is.
For the listener who comes at this with having just learned the buzzwords of organic viticulture and biodynamics and natural, and then there is this new term that we're talking about, where does everything else fit in? And I appreciate what Jamie said about how he framed it as far as there are certain recipes, and then there's more of a holistic view that doesn't necessarily have a prescriptive model. I think what's what's interesting is to ask the question, how does it all fit the umbrella of the term regenerative viticulture?
When I think about regeneration, it's about regenerating the soil and also regenerating the climate. And so there's a really strong emphasis, as Jamie was just saying, on the soil health. And as he was saying, monitoring and really keeping track of what's happening on the ground and in the ground. So really looking at the organic matter and the carbon in the soil. And that's something that we work with our members to do. So it's all about those healthy soils. And it doesn't necessarily have to be organic or biodynamic. I think many people have that synergy who are practicing regenerative agriculture, but it doesn't necessarily have to have that element of certification. And I think Jamie agrees. So Jamie, share more.
Yeah, I think organics and biodynamics gets you kind of a good distance along the journey to being more regenerative, because one of the emphases in both these farming systems is on soil health. So there's a really, really good start. And I think that, across the wine world, there's lots of biodynamic wine growers who I visited who are doing a really good job in the vineyard. Where does regenerative fit in that sense? Well, I think one of the things is that often in organic and biodynamic farming, obviously no herbicides are allowed, and it's very common to use tillage, whether it's a tractor or a horse or whatever, to turn the soil over. And regenerative approaches that seem to, you're kind of undoing some of the good work you do when you do this, because it's really not very good for soil health. And the other thing is that in organics and biodynamics, because Vitis vinifera, which is the species of wine grape that gives us all the varieties we know and love, lacks resistance genes to powdery and downy mildew, then some sort of chemical sprays are needed. In organics and biodynamics, elemental sulfur and copper-based fungicides like Bordeaux mixture are used. And the copper ones are the problem, because to fight downy mildew is very, very difficult if you live in a climate where there's any sort of moisture around, to keep a lid on downy mildew without using copper-based fungicides. And copper is really bad for soil life. So you've got this sort of problem there that needs addressing. And in regenerative viticulture, I think it's maybe a mistake to tie certification with organics, because that then restricts the pool of the number of people who are willing to do it or are able to do it. And the thing I like about regenerative approaches is this is something that big companies can put in place. This is something people with hundreds of hectares of vineyards can start implementing, and can start, conserving the life in the soil, encouraging the life in the soil, without committing to using fungicides that are contact fungicides that have to be resprayed every time it rains, have limited efficacy, and also which contain copper, which is not good for soil health. So it's about taking a holistic view. It's about taking a look at the vineyard and saying, given the conditions we're in, what's the best way we can farm, and what's the readout? And clearly one of the readouts is you want a really good crop of healthy grapes of good quality, of the sort of quality that's appropriate to the wines that you're making. That's a non-negotiable. But after that, you can say, well, let's look at what we're doing in our soils. Are they improving? What's the soil life like there? And the vineyard itself, are we reducing the inputs we put in by the approaches that we're taking in the vineyard? And so I think those are really interesting questions.
Jamie and Anna, I think many of us have regenerative agriculture and no-till kind of wound up in our minds together. And Jamie, you mentioned turning over the soil and how important it is to keep that carbon in the soil. I know you said it's not prescriptive, but would you say that no-till is kind of a basic requirement of being a regenerative farmer, or what's the role of the no-till movement?
Well, personally, I think you want to avoid tillage as much as possible. But in some situations, I'm speaking to Steve Mathiasson, who's a really good wine grower in Napa in California. And Steve was saying that, they've tried regenerative approaches, and they've tried no-till, but it simply doesn't work in their situation, because one of the problems they've got is gophers, these little rodents that if you don't till in the vine row itself at all, they become a huge problem in the vineyards. And so, faced with the prospect of losing half your vines or doing a bit of tillage, they're doing a bit of tillage. And they're also doing that because they find that some situations, the competition for water is a little too extreme in very dry seasons in their place. So they do a little bit of tillage. But Steve says he's also looking at the soil carbon, and he's saying that, yeah, maybe you lose a little bit. But actually, their approach, which is a very thoughtful approach, it's regenerative in pretty much every way, apart from that limited tillage, is resulting in a gain in soil carbon year by year. So in some ways, you want to encourage people to follow regenerative practices, but ultimately there has to be a leeway there. Otherwise, simply you wouldn't be able to do it in some places.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you asked that question, Catherine, because that's a question we get a lot. And we don't require that our grower members practice no tillage. So Jamie and I are very aligned on this. But we do really encourage what's called conservation tillage or reduced tillage, maybe just every other row or just reducing the number of passes. And there's a lot of benefits to that, even if you aren't going all the way to no-till, as Jamie was just saying, for Steve, who I've also talked to about the tillage issue. So yeah, it's an important distinction.
Yeah, and I think that it's all about, getting things growing in the vineyards. Biodiversity is one of the keys to regenerative approaches. The more life you can bring into the system, the more resilient the ecosystem is, and the more sort of ecosystem services you get that reduce the inputs. But sometimes it requires a bit of bravery, because you've got to these things you have to, they're almost paradoxes, you have to balance. And so if you're in a dry Mediterranean climate, water is obviously at a premium at certain points in the year. But at the same time, if you don't have anything growing there, then the soil structure suffers. And when the rain does come, it doesn't infiltrate the soil very well. And obviously, we also know that soil organic material is really good at holding water. I think Mimi Castile said recently that improving the soil organic carbon by 1% resulted in an acre being able to hold 68,000 litres more water. If you can get soil organic material in place, then when you get the water into the soil, it's going to stick around a bit longer and be more accessible to the plants.
Wow.
So it's this contrast, you've got this contrast between, you don't want competition with the vines at certain points of the year, but it's a very arid climate. But at the same time, if you don't have other stuff growing there, the soil structure isn't going to be conducive to infiltration by rain when it does occur, and you won't have much to hold the water in the soil at that point. So it does require a bit of courage and a bit of experimentation, I think.
I just wanted to quickly mention that Mimi Castile is an outspoken proponent of regenerative agriculture, and she is based here in the Willamette Valley, and she is from the Bethel Heights family, just in case people want to look her up and all her amazing work.
Yeah, so I just have to jump in and say how happy we were to have had Mimi Castile with us at the Rise Climate and Wine Symposium on April 13th. That was our event focused on proactive farming and soil health and biodiversity. And yes, she is such a champion. So great to have her involved.
And Jamie, your example using Mimi's analysis of how much water retention increases in the soil underscores the interrelated aspect of systemic climate action and sustainability, right? We could talk about the water pillar of water efficiency and water conservation, and when we talk about soil health, that increases the retention of water and reduces that impact. You mentioned, Jamie, again, the word recipe, right? Where there's a prescriptive yes and no, a binary do this or don't do that nature of some of the practices, viticulture practices, organic, biodynamic, whereas regenerative farming may be seen as goal-oriented instead of recipe-oriented.
That's a very good summary, I think. I'd encourage anybody who's producing a sort of a certification program to think about looking at some sort of results-oriented certification rather than process-oriented certification.
Mm-hmm.
That is exactly what we do. I love it. We're looking at the results. So we let people pick and choose from the kind of toolkit, as you mentioned, the recipe book, and then track the results on the ground. So yes, absolutely agree.
I think that's very empowering for wine growers as well. It's actually treating them as partners in this process rather than, recipe followers. And it gives people creative options to kind of look and see and try things that they think, well, this might actually help,
You know what's great about this too is so much of what we're trying to do right now as we're facing this climate disaster is not harm the earth. And even in the very term regenerative, the goal of regenerative agriculture is to heal the earth, to leave it healthier than it was when we started. And I love the positivity of that mission.
Excellent. So, Anna, moving on, this will be the final installment in our series of special episodes on the 6 pillars of sustainability, established and created, I should say, by you, that concept of the 6 pillars. So we've been meaning to ask, why did you choose to group climate action together with regenerative agriculture? Why connect those two?
Yeah, great question. In some ways, it should be, and in fact, it is, regenerative agriculture is tied into the pillar of proactive farming and soil health and biodiversity very deeply. But we also wanted to explicitly connect it to climate action because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has named these nature-based solutions, including regenerative carbon farming, as one of the top 5 ways to address the climate crisis. So these types of practices have all these benefits that we've been talking about in terms of resilience to disease and drought and heat stress and water infiltration and retention, but also store carbon. It's this proactive role, as I said, that farmers can play in being a part of the solution. And so it's so critical. These regenerative practices are so critical to addressing the climate crisis that we really wanted to explicitly connect the 2 topics, even though, as you said, all 5 of the preceding pillars roll into climate action and help reduce the carbon footprint. But regenerative agriculture is particularly important to bring to the top.
That makes perfect sense. You just reminded me, Anna, of the wonderful biologist and author Anna Brittain, based in Seattle. I got to know her work through LIVE, the Low Input Viticulture and Enology organization here in Oregon. And I was just listening to an interview with her, and she just has such a great way of framing things. She said, I'm not quoting directly, but something along the lines of, carbon is life in the soil and death in the air. And that, to me, tied together, okay, regenerative agriculture, putting that carbon into the soil and creating life from it. There's a fixed amount of carbon on this earth. Let's put it back in the soil instead of releasing it in the air.
I love that. I hadn't heard that quote before. I'm going to use that.
She's very quotable. This episode is supported by LIVE. That's LIVE, standing for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. And I am so pleased to be joined by LIVE's Executive Director, Chris Serra. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, nice to see you again. Over the past couple of episodes, you and I have chatted about LIVE's commitment to biodiversity, pesticide reduction, natural resource conservation, and social sustainability, including worker rights. So now let's bring it on home. Let's talk about soil health and the big one, climate action.
Sure. The wine industry has been at the forefront of the climate movement in so many ways, and we really take climate action seriously at LIVE. Our members must meet internationally accredited and peer-reviewed standards annually, and our work is grounded in the latest research by university scientists and environmental NGOs.
And, in viticultural circles, climate action and soil health are often mentioned and talked about in the same conversations, but I think it can be a little confusing for folks who are not part of these conversations. So can you kind of make that connection for us between climate action and soil health?
Of course. Many of our members take a regenerative approach to cover crop management and use minimal tillage, if at all. This reduces the fuel used in tractor passes, it keeps carbon sequestered in the ground, and it preserves the health of the soil. They use other simple techniques like mowing every other row, which can greatly reduce fossil fuel emissions and soil compaction, and it also allows beneficial insect populations to thrive.
And we love those beneficial insects because they do the work for us.
Right.
Okay, so tell me about the overall footprint of the wine business. So much of our carbon emissions come from the supply chain, right? Like shipping and packaging, and these are things we don't talk enough about.
That's right. Yeah, bottles and packaging actually have the largest share of the carbon footprint in the winemaking process, over a third. All of our winery members are required to complete a greenhouse gas assessment and develop a plan for reducing their footprint. Live wineries are encouraged to reduce their bottle weights below a 480 gram threshold, and they earn bonus points for eliminating all bottles over 680 grams.
As it should be. Folks, you really do not need a punt if you're not making traditional method sparkling wine, and that is all I have to say about that. Okay, so we've been talking about reducing tractor usage, soil health, glass bottles. These all great things, but can you tie it all together for me, Chris?
I hope so. We recently commissioned a greenhouse gas study of the entire wine industry of the Pacific Northwest, and we learned that the entire annual carbon footprint of Oregon's share is equivalent to about 11,000 Oregon white oak trees, which is a keystone species in this region. We decided to set up a network of wineries to gather acorns from the community and to grow them into saplings to distribute to landowners. I think that equivocating greenhouse gas emissions to an important local tree species in decline can actually help growers and winemakers to grasp the scope of their impacts on the environment, and we can hopefully address multiple issues with this one initiative.
Oh, this is brilliant. I love it. You know, Oregon white oaks are so iconic. If you have not been to Willamette Valley wine country, please come out and admire our beautiful white oaks. So let's plant 11,000 of them. I love this idea, Chris. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about Live. And listeners, that's Low Input Viticulture and Enology. Thank you, Live, for supporting the Foretop.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the important work you're doing this season.
Thanks.
Hey, Anna, how tired are you of getting the glyphosate question?
Yeah, I could talk for a whole episode about that. Pretty tired. I think one of the issues there, so glyphosate is Roundup, for those who don't know that, is it's just one herbicide. It's absolutely the most prolific herbicide. Is it an herbicide I wish were illegal? Absolutely. But I think there's a lack of understanding that there's a whole group of herbicides available to growers. And so if you just say, let's get rid of Roundup, many, let's say, growers are just shifting to another herbicide, and that has its own risks and its own problems. And I think the other issue there for me, and I use this term kind of, we're missing the climate for the weeds a little bit. You know, we are in a climate crisis. We have to act so quickly to make change. Jamie made this same point. If you tie it to requiring organic, it limits the number of people at the table. And we need as many people at the table as possible, moving as quickly as possible. And pesticides and herbicides are just one small piece of the overall picture. I mean, our vineyard program has 6 elements, and that's including, water and forest health and carbon farming and how you handle your burning of your wood waste and your forest tree waste, and social justice and diversity and inclusion. So there's so many other holistic, systematic elements that we need to be thinking about. And I just feel like we get overly myopic when we're just focusing on the Roundup question.
Yeah, as a scientist, it really frustrates me the way people have approached glyphosate, because glyphosate is harmless. We don't have the chemical pathways in our bodies that glyphosate attacks, which is the shikimate pathway. So, glyphosate is not a dangerous herbicide. It's actually quite safe, but it is a herbicide. And let me clarify that a little bit. What I'm saying is that I don't like glyphosate because I don't like herbicides, because it takes the use of herbicides removes things growing in the vineyard. And when you don't have things growing in the vineyard, you don't have life in the soils, and you lose soil structure, you get compaction. And also glyphosate acts as a chelator as well. So it actually affects the nutrition that the vine receives. So I think we should avoid herbicides full stop. But I think that the current dialogue is based on ignorance, where people think glyphosate is actually really dangerous. It's actually much better than the alternative herbicides. It's the least bad option when it comes to herbicides. And if people ban glyphosate, then all the growers will do is they'll just use other herbicides. And I've even heard organic growers talking about using organic herbicides. And I think this is completely wrong-minded. It's the killing the plants that grow in the soil other than the vines, that leads to the loss of life in the soils. So that's kind of something that frustrates me a little bit, because it's very unscientific, the dialogue, and it's very emotional, and it's based on a lot of ignorance and unwillingness to actually investigate the issues to see what they are. And so I'd also say that, I went to a conference in Arles in France, and Nigel Greening made a really interesting contribution. He said that climate chaos, global warming, is like a heart attack. You deal with a heart attack. You don't stand around giving people advice about their diet and, you should smoke, you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink so much. You deal with a heart attack, and that's what we have to do with the climate crisis. Sustainability can come later, in effect. That's the emergency that faces us. So we need to do all we can in the face of climate chaos to try and do something about this heart attack that the world is facing. The other stuff can come later. First of all, you save the patient. And I think in terms of regenerative farming, I think that sometimes you could say, well, actually, given the resources that are involved, and obviously an element of sustainability is financial sustainability, maybe one use of glyphosate a year, and then, allowing other things to grow in the vine row and, working in a more organic way could be the best way for that particular situation. You just don't know. I think so. Ruling things out completely, I think, may actually hinder people making the sort of progress they need to make. And the other thing I'd say is it's all very well if, there's 90 hectares in the USA that are farmed beautifully and perfectly. But really what we want is hundreds of thousands of hectares farmed in a better way than they're farmed now. That's the real goal. Because it's about everyone doing it, not just a few.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your message, Jamie, but I want to make sure that listeners don't just start applying Roundup without wearing a mask. When you said it's not toxic, you mean if it's applied to the soil properly, once you ingest the wine or the end product, it's not toxic. But obviously, direct contact with glyphosate is dangerous.
No, this is actually something I'd contest, because it's obviously you want to be careful with anything you're spraying on a vineyard. But the active ingredient in glyphosate, you could drink the stuff. It's not going to touch you. If there's other stuff added to the Roundup or the other brands of it, so there's often things added as well as the actual active molecule. But the actual molecule, it targets a pathway that humans and mammals don't have. So it's not going to hurt you.
I mean, I think we might have to agree to disagree on this one. I think just from the science I've reviewed, I do think that really sustained exposure to glyphosate has been shown to create health risks. But I do think that most growers are applying this very safely. And in that case, as you were saying, Catherine, there isn't a risk as it ends up in any way in the wine.
It is a powerfully ensconced word, both Roundup and glyphosate, in the collective consciousness of people that pay attention to this stuff, right? And there's science beyond over my head and not over Dr. Jamie Goode's head, but that it's a powerful, there's heated debate around this. Elimination pathways, all that kind of stuff. And the unfortunate bit about this is that whatever side you stand on around this subject, it tends to dominate and obscure the rest of the important conversations. The heart attack that Jamie just mentioned, in terms of priorities, the glyphosate conversation isn't the top of the priority. It is the decarbonization of our world. That is the heart attack that Jamie's talking about. When we consider with Napa Green, as some of you may know, I'm on the board for Napa Green. When we consider the glyphosate and Roundup issue, it wakes up all kinds of emotional opinions about the subject. Some people are like, "Oh my gosh, finally, thank you. That's the most important thing. Now I can support Napa Green." And other people are like, the reality is that we kind of have to use it once or twice a year to apply to sustain our business, whereas we're focusing on other things like reducing our glass weight, taking less business trips, right? Increasing our water or energy efficiencies. And that's really where I see the conversation taking place, the systemic nature of this, which is why this is the sixth pillar.
Yeah, another way we talk about it is you want to focus on what you do want to do, the things we do want to do to encourage life and diversity and taking action, and not focus so much on the don't do, right? The things that we don't want to do. Let's focus on the do, the positive, the action, the getting in motion, I think is very critical.
Yeah, and on that line, I'd say the problem with herbicides, it really is that, it's hard to achieve the goals of having more life when you use herbicides. I mean, if you can use herbicides and you can show an increase in your soil organic material and your soil structure, and you can avoid compaction, and you can, all these things, then go ahead and use them. It's the issue is that it's very hard to reach your regenerative goals when you're not allowing anything to grow in the soil. And the knock-on effects of not having plant roots in the soil are massive. And plants release between 10 and 40% of their photosynthates into the soil. They're doing it for a very good reason, because they're encouraging the soil life, they're encouraging mycorrhizal growth, they're encouraging all these things that create a living soil that then does all these wonderful ecosystem services for the vineyard.
Well, I think we're almost ready to wrap, and I'm just wondering, Anna and Jamie, if you have any kind of final takeaways you want to leave our listeners with as we close out this season on sustainability, especially on this note of climate action.
We do hear a lot of oh yeah, there's a lot of bigger growers or larger companies that can afford to do this, but can the smaller growers or smaller vintners or winemakers really afford to do this? And so I have to always jump in on that question around how many actual opportunities there are. And I know I've shared this earlier, to actually cut the bottom line. Jamie referred to that economic sustainability element, to actually save money as you're improving energy efficiency, as you're improving water efficiency, which reduces the energy used to transport heat and treat that water, as you're reducing waste and waste management pickups. There's all kinds of financial benefits as you're lightening glass, and then often reducing shipments and reducing costs. And I think the other thing that we have to really talk more and more about is that connection between sustainability and regenerative agriculture and quality, and the quality of the fruit and the quality of the wine that is coming from these practices. And I've seen so many growers, one that comes to mind, Julie Johnson at Tres Sabores, very small operation that sees so many quality benefits from having invested in these practices. So that's another important point I want to make.
And I'd say two things. First, I'd say that people have to work in vineyards, and it must be so much more pleasurable working in a vineyard where there's lots of life, where it really is an ecosystem that's buzzing with energy, with life, with insects, with plants. So I think that's really exciting. And secondly, I really am so enthused about regenerative viticulture because its basis is science. Its basis is really good science applied in intelligent ways. And it's just that in the past, our scientific understanding of viticulture was very limited. But now I think we're beginning to see, with this increasing awareness of the importance of soil life and of the interactions between different organisms within an ecosystem like a vineyard, we're beginning to see that the real science. And I think that's great, because this makes regenerative really accessible to everyone. You don't have to believe in a certain, unusual belief. You don't have to sign up to, something that stretches credulity. You can actually, be scientifically rational and adopt this and measure the progress that you're making along the way.
Love that. Thank you both, Anna and Jamie. I'm super excited about the direction that viticulture is going in, and thank you for spreading the word about regenerative agriculture. And now it is time for our figurative dessert course, our figurative dessert wine, in which we just share something wonderful that we've been enjoying recently. Anna, what did you bring for us?
Mine is absolutely wine related, which is that I have fallen absolutely in love with Croatia. Anyone who hasn't gone to Croatia, you need to go. I've been 4 times. I'm going my 5th time this May, which I'm very excited about. And their wine regions are absolutely gorgeous, and they have some beautiful wines. Of course, Malvasia is the main one people might have heard of, but they've got some beautiful sparkling wines and even some Pinot up in the hillside. So it's a place I recommend. Purchase your carbon offsets for the flight, but do go to Croatia. I love it.
Excellent.
If you need a travel buddy, I'm there for you, Anna.
Yeah, let's do it.
Jamie, what is your figurative dessert course?
With me and my work, and also when I drink for pleasure as well, I often go through seasons where I'm looking at one particular country or one style of wine or a grape variety. And at the moment, I'm on a sort of bit of a Greek odyssey. So I was in Greece a couple of weeks ago at a big wine fair called Inorama and did some touring around some vineyards. And for the last, for this period, I'm just kind of on the lookout for chances to try Greek wines because they're really interesting. And there's obviously a long history of wine in Greece. There's also a set of indigenous grape varieties I really love. So Sinomavro and Certico, Agiogitico, and my pronunciation is really terrible, I think, on some of these, and Rhoditis, and things like that, So I'm just really enjoying exploring a field that I hadn't explored in great detail before, and both as a professional in terms of going to tastings, but also as a consumer, just going to the bottle shop and finding a bottle, or in a restaurant seeing a Greek wine on a list and giving it a crack. And it's really rewarding. So Greek for me at the moment.
Jamie, I'm thrilled that you mentioned that because we met recently in LA with the Perfectly Imperfect wines, and you brought out Lopez de Heredia as an example, the white, something that we import in California. And we have a juicy selection of Greek wines that I'm starting to get into as an importer. From Nausa, we got the Amantakos, Karanika, Zoinos, Tetramitos, Monvasia, Patrianakis from the Crete Islands. And hearing you talk about them this way, Vaeni even, my pronunciation is even worse than yours. Don't worry about that. And I bring them in business wise. That's music to my ears to hear that, and I think to also mention to our listeners, give Greek wines a chance, just for the reasons that Jamie just mentioned.
Very cool.
Let's all get together in person and have a Zina Mavro, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong, but beautiful wine.
Excellent. All right, so my dessert course. There's a lot of evils and problems with Instagram, but there's some positives too. And I started to follow this gentleman who is Creative Explained, and it's a gentleman that is putting out these really cool tips. He shows you how to save the parts of vegetables or produce that you normally throw out, and either regrow them or salvage them or repurpose them. And he has a book called Don't Throw It Out, and it's plant hacks, kitchen hacks, tips and tricks. And one of my favorite things I learned about recently is how you use your coffee grounds, put them into some water, throw some cinnamon in, and then you have this natural plant fertilizer with a bunch of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And it's fascinating just how much we can extend the life of the things that we consume or reduce the amount of waste if we learn a little bit of these tips and tricks. So to me, Creative Explained is someone worth following if you care about this kind of stuff.
Ooh, that sounds wonderful. I'm going to check that out. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, of course.
And for my dessert, I have been enjoying the series Getting Warmer with Kal Penn, the actor and comedian Kal Penn. I think he's best known as Kumar in the Harold and Kumar movies, but he actually took a break from acting to work as a staffer in the Obama administration and is really smart about policy and issues and has this series. I found it on the Bloomberg website, and it's a terrific overview of the climate crisis. But, Kal Penn is also a comedian, and so he just has a really kind of wonderful way of delivering the message. He also talks about innovative solutions that are being developed right now, so it's not all gloom and doom. And one moment in the series that really stuck with me is this company called Sky Cool Systems that has developed air conditioning that does not require electricity. And the founders were inspired by something called a yakchal. I'm probably going to pronounce that wrong. I probably did pronounce that wrong, which is a 2,000-year-old method of making ice in the desert and storing it indefinitely, basically just harnessing the Earth's natural night cooling effects. So it sort of drove home to me the point that all the resources we need to fight this climate issue are right here in front of us. And it just takes some smart minds and some ingenuity. And I think we can do this. We really can. So thank you, guests. Listeners, you can read about our guest, Dr. Jamie Goode, and read his extremely influential wine blog at wineanorak.com. And by the way, Jamie, for those of us who are American, what is an anorak?
So an anorak is an outer garment, a coat, usually quite a big coat with a hood So the anoraks became notorious because people used to have this strange hobby in the UK of going to stations. This is in the days when they still had steam trains, and then people would go to the stations, especially the busy ones like Crewe or something like that, and they'd watch all the trains coming past. They'd take their numbers and their notebooks. So these train spotters became known as anoraks because frequently they'd be wearing the anorak as their garment of choice. And so in popular sort of parlance in the UK, we use the term anorak for anyone who's got a nerdy, geeky interest in something. And so it's a sort of form of self-parody. I came across the term, wine anorak when I was doing a tasting for consumers years and years ago when I was just starting out. And one woman said to me, "Do you know what you are?" And I said, "What?" She said, "You're a wine anorak." So I thought that was an idea, but I didn't think at all about the fact that everyone else must think, what on earth is this website? So, yeah.
I just always assumed I had this vision of you with your big coat on walking through a rainy, cold vineyard, but this is much better. I love this. Thanks for sharing the story.
And for our listeners, it's spelled Anorak, A-N-O-R-A-K. So wineanorak.com. And you could read about Anna Brittain's work at napagreen.org and the symposium that occurred in April, Napa Rise. The website there is risegreen.org, which I co-founded with Anna. But also a shout out to the rest of our founding coalition, the committee there, Dan Petrosky, Beth Novak Milliken, and Molly Shepard at Spotswood, Michelle Novi, Todd Mostero, Dominus, and a whole host of people that helped us put that symposium together 2 years in a row. We'll see what the future brings. And if you want to learn more about me, Martin Reyes, you can also check out winewise.biz.
Yes, and you can find out about me at catherinecole.com. But why would you do that when you can go to theforetop.org, find our social media handles, get in touch with us, let us know what you thought of this episode and this series. And also, please, please, please support The Foretop by leaving us a rating on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Signing out from Napa adjacent small seaside village town, Benicia. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
And signing out from the increasingly regeneratively farmed Willamette Valley. Thanks, everyone. It's been wonderful to talk about sustainability this season. So thanks for tuning in.
This has been the Foretop Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer. Nick Toole is our producer. And I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor Michelle Richards, media and design manager Ruby Welkovich, and sales director Kristen Castagna. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. If you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes or Spotify, please do so, and please leave us a rating. Every rating feeds the algorithm and helps new listeners find The Foretop. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.